Hey, boys and girls, welcome back to Mimi's Fun Time. Well, I know you see this glare. It's coming from our sun roof, so I can't help that. But anyway, today I'm going to read you Peter Pan, and it will be chapters 1 through 9. And next weekend, we will go from chapter 9 to, well, let me see, how many chapters? To 15. So y'all gather around and here we go for the adventure of Peter Pan. The Darling family lived in London. Wendy was the oldest of the Darling children. John followed her, while Michael was the youngest. When she was younger, Wendy would often think that her parents would give her away, as there were too many mouths to feed. Her father was extremely proud of her, but he never showed it. The family had a dog, a Newfoundland called Nana. They trusted her with their lives. Nana was their appointed nurse for the kids. All in all, the Darlings were the simplest, happiest family in London until Peter Pan came. The Darling children often thought of Neverland, which was more or less an island with vibrant colors and clear water surrounding the island with coral reefs. Peter Pan lived here with Tinkerbell, a tiny fairy. For each child, Neverland had something different. John, for instance, had flamingos in his Neverland, which would fly over a lagoon while he shot at them. Michael, who was small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over in it in his mind. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands. Michael in a wigwam. Wendy in a house of leaves, definitely sewn together. Occasionally, Mrs. Darling would question them about Peter Pan. She knew nothing of him, yet he was always there in the minds of her children. When Wendy was questioned about him, she sadly admitted that he was strange. "But, my pet, who is he?" asked Mrs. Darling. "Peter Pan, Mother," replied Wendy. "He hasn't grown up at all. He's just my size." Wendy said with this a lot of confidence, like she knew it for a fact. When Mrs. Darling told her husband about this, he just laughed it off and told her to leave the children to their imagination. It will go away, he assured her. But it didn't, and soon Peter Pan gave Mrs. Darling quite a shock. Quite often, she would find dry leaves in the nursery that weren't there when she put the children to sleep. There were also muddy footprints on the floor. Wendy just shook her head and smiled at this. "It's Peter again." "What do you mean, Wendy?" "He never wipes his feet," Wendy sighed. She explained frankly to her mother that she thought Peter sometimes came into the nursery, sat at the foot of her bed, and played his pipes for her. Somehow, she was always asleep, and even though she didn't see him while awake, she knew it was him. "What nonsense! No one can get into the house without knocking," argued Mrs. Darling. "Mother, he uses the window." "The nursery window is 3 floors up, Wendy." Later, she found dry leaves near the window. Wendy found this natural, and Mrs. Darling found it hard to dismiss. The very next night, the lives of Wendy and her brothers were going to change forever. Chapter 2. Come away, come away. The next night, Mr. and Mrs. Darling went out to the dinner party. The Darling children wanted to stay awake when Peter arrived, but somehow they always fell fast asleep before he did. Later that night, while the children slept, Nana walked in to check on them. She saw a strange boy entering through the window. so she growled and jumped on him. He leaped lightly out through the window. As he reached forward to pull the window shut, he saw something hanging from Nana's mouth. It was a shadow. After Nana left the room, a tiny glowing light flew inside quickly. It went inside cupboards and drawers as if looking for Peter's shadow. The moving light was actually a tiny fairy called Tinker Bell. A minute after she entered, the windows burst open and Peter flew in. "Tinker Bell," he called out to her softly so that the children wouldn't wake up. "Tink, where are you? Tink, tell me, where have they put my shadow?" The loveliest tinkle, like that of golden bells, answered him. It was fairy language. She told him that the shadow was in the chest of drawers. Peter went to the chest immediately, scattering its contents on the floor. Tinker Bell entered the drawer to help him. When he finally found the shadow, he was so happy that he shut the drawer with Tinker Bell in it. Peter went to the bathroom and tried sticking his shadow back on by using soap. When the shadow kept slipping off, he sat on the floor and began to cry. His sobs woke Wendy up. "Boy, why are you crying?" she asked. In response, Peter stood on his feet and bowed beautifully as a mark of courtesy to her. She was so pleased that, from her bed, she curtsied equally well. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy Moore Angela Darling. What's your name?" "Peter Pan." "Is that all?" "Yes," he replied sharply, realizing how short his name was next to her name. When she asked where he lived, he told her that he lived on the second star to the right and straight on till morning. "That's a funny address," she replied. "It is not," he countered back. "Do you have a mother?" she asked. He remained silent and lowered his head. "Oh dear, no wonder you've been crying." She climbed off her bed and went to him. "I wasn't crying because I don't have a mother. I was crying because I couldn't find my shadow to stick," Peter said. "It was to be sewn on. I'll do it for you," said Wendy. As she sewed the shadow back on, she noticed that he was clenching his teeth because of the pain. Once she was done, he jumped around the room with joy. Unfortunately, he forgot to give Wendy the credit and thought that he had sewed the shadow back on by himself. "How clever I am," he crowed rapturously. "Oh, the cleverness of me." Wendy was shocked. Peter said, "Wendy, I can't help being this way when I'm happy. One girl is always more useful than 20 boys, you know." "Do you really think so?" she asked, and Peter solemnly nodded. Wendy happily got out of bed and told him that she would give him a kiss. But Peter didn't know what a kiss was, so he held out his hand to receive it. "Don't you know what a kiss is?" Wendy asked, shocked. "I'll know when you give it to me," Peter replied stiffly. She gave him a thimble so that his feelings wouldn't get hurt. "May I kiss you now?" Peter asked Wendy. "If you like," she replied primly, slowly inclining her face toward his. But Peter just dropped an acorn button into her hand. Blushing slightly, she thanked him and put the acorn button around the chain she wore. It was lucky she did, for that very acorn button turned out to save her life later on. "How old are you?" Wendy asked Peter. "I don't know exactly, but I am young," he said. "I ran away from home to look for fairies the day I was born. But some of us don't believe in fairies anymore," Wendy said gravely. "Don't say that," Peter cried. Each time you say something like not believing in fairies, somewhere a fairy drops dead. He got up and called out for Tinkerbell. Peter, is there a fairy in this room? Wendy asked. She was here. Can you hear her? Only the sound of twinkling bells. That, Wendy, is the language of the fairies, Peter said. He noticed the sound was coming from the chest of drawers. He laughed. I think I've locked her in there by mistake. After he let the poor fairy out, she flew all over him, making agitated signs with her hands. Now, Tink, don't say that. I didn't mean to lock you in there. Peter, I would like to see her. Can she hold still? Cried Wendy. When Tinkerbell finally settled on top of the table, Wendy gushed on how beautiful the fairy was. Tink, said Peter angrily, this lady says she wishes you were her fairy. Tinkerbell shook her head insolently. But what does she say, Peter? Asked Wendy. Peter had to translate. She is not very polite. She says you are an ugly girl and that she is my fairy. Wendy sat down on an armchair and asked Peter whom he lived with. He told her he lived with the lost boys. Who are they? She asked. They are those children whose nurses lose them when they are babies. If not found in a week, they are sent to Neverland. I'm their captain, declared Peter. Wendy asked if there were any girls there. No girls are too clever to fall out of the prams, said Peter. I think, Wendy said, it is perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls. John, there just hates girls. In reply, Peter rose and kicked John out of the bed, blankets and all, in one kick. John and Michael got up, hearing all the noise in the nursery. Mrs. Darling came in to check. It was too dark in the nursery, and the children hid behind the curtains and made angelic breathing sounds. As though they were asleep, Mrs. Darling thought it was Nana who was being naughty. She woke Mrs. Darling, who went and tied poor Nana up in the kennel. After they had left, Wendy asked Peter if he came every night. She was mildly disappointed to find out that he came to hear her stories, not to see her. Just then, Peter grabbed her hand and started pulling her towards the window. Peter, let me go, she cried. Come back with me. You can tell the lost boys some of your stories, he pleaded. But I can't, said Wendy sadly. I don't even know how to fly. I'll teach you. How could she resist? Of course. It's awfully fascinating, she said. Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too? He nodded, so Wendy happily asked John and Michael if they would also like to learn how to fly. I say, Peter, can you really fly? Asked John, putting on his glasses. Instead of answering him, Peter flew around the room, taking the mantelpiece on the way. Both John and Michael clapped their hands with glee. They asked how they could fly. Peter grabbed some fairy dust from Tinkerbell and blew it all over them. He then told them to think happy thoughts. They closed their eyes and thought of the happiest memory. When they opened their eyes again, they were airborne. They all cried out their joy and shock. Look at me, I'm flying. I'll be taking you to the land where there are mermaids. Mermaids, cried Wendy. And pirates, said Peter. Pirates, cried John and Michael. Let's go, they all cried. Led by Tinkerbell and Peter, the three darling children went out, flying through the window into the twinkling stars. Chapter 3, The Flight. To go to Neverland, the children had to go to the second star on the right and straight on till morning. Peter Pan's companions trusted him and followed him wherever he flew. The trouble was, at this hour of the night, the darling children were sleepy, and if any one of them dozed off, he or she would drop to the ground like a stone. What was worse, Peter found this hilarious. After all, he could sleep in the air without falling. Be nice, Peter. What if he leaves us? Wendy told her two little brothers. We could go back, Michael said happily. How could we ever find our way back without him? Well, then, we could go on, said John. That is the awful thing, John. We just have to go on, for we don't know how to stop. It was true, for Peter had forgotten to show them how to stop. John told them that if worst came to worst, they should just fly straight ahead. Since the world was round, they'd come back to London eventually. After flying on for what seemed like hours, he cried out, "We get off here." Where? Where? Where all the arrows are pointing. They saw millions of golden arrows pointing out to an island guided by the sun, who wanted to make sure the children didn't get lost before he retired for the night. As they saw the island, the children were shocked, for this was the same island they had dreamt about every night. John, there's the lagoon, cried Wendy. I see your flamingo with the broken leg. Michael, there's your cave. Wendy, there's your wolf with her cubs in the bushes. John, I see smoke over the redskin camp, said Wendy. All this time, Peter grew annoyed that they knew so much about his island. As he guided them lower, he whispered to John, "Would you like to have an adventure, John? Or would you like to have your tea first?" John hesitated. "What kind of an adventure?" he asked cautiously. "There's a pirate asleep in the pampas just beneath us," Peter told him. "If you like, we'll go down and kill him." "I don't see him," John said after a long pause. "I do. What if he woke up?" "I only kill them when they are awake, not while they're asleep," Peter replied indignantly. John asked Peter who the pirate captain was. "Hook," said Peter, with a look of hatred on his face. Michael began to cry, and even John could speak in gulps only, for they knew Hook's reputation. "He is the worst of them all. He is the only man of whom the famous dreadful pirate Long John Silver was afraid." "What is he like? Is he big?" John asked. "He is not as big as he was." "How do you mean?" "I cut off a bit of him, his right hand. He wears an iron hook in place of it," said Peter. "John, I want you to promise me, if we meet Hook in a fight, you leave him to me." "I promise," said John loyally. Just then, Tinkerbell fluttered around Peter. He told the others that they had been spotted by the pirates. They saw Tink's light. "Tell her to go away at once, Peter," the three cried at once, but Peter refused. "She's frightened too. I can't send her away." "Then tell her to put her light out," begged Wendy. "She can't put it out. That is about the only thing fairies can't do. It just goes out itself when she falls asleep." "Then tell her to sleep at once," John almost ordered. "She can't sleep except when she's sleepy. It's the only other thing fairies can't do." Peter grabbed John's hat and put Tinkerbell there. The cover of the black top hat covered her globe completely. As they were flying, the air suddenly shook with a tremendous blast. The pirates had fired cannons at them. Luckily, no one got hit, but Peter had been carried by the wind of the shot far out to sea, while Wendy was blown upward with no one but Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell had waited for this moment. She flew out of the hat and got Wendy to follow her. What else could poor Wendy do? She called to Peter, John, and Michael, and got only mocking echoes in reply. Wendy did not yet know that Tink was jealous of Wendy and hated her fiercely. And now, staggering in her flight, she followed Tink to her doom. Chapter 4. The Island Come True. Neverland buzzed to life upon Peter's arrival, but that evening the Lost Boys came out to look for Peter. The pirates came out looking for the Lost Boys. The Redskins were looking for the pirates. The beasts were looking for the Redskins. They were all over the island. All of them wanted blood, except the Lost Boys, who just wanted to find their captain. The Lost Boys wore animal skins. There were 6 of them in all. There were Toodles, Nibs, Slightly, Curly, and the twins. Just as the Lost Boys disappeared, the pirates filled their place. There was the handsome Italian Seco, the tattooed Billy Jukes, Cookson, Gentleman Starkey, Noodler, Rob Mullins, Alf Mason, and Irishman Smee. Finally, there was Captain James Hook himself. In person, he was absolutely deathly looking and dark-faced. His hair was in long black curls. He had beautiful, soulful blue eyes that turned hard when he was sticking his hook through someone. As the pirates went on their way, the Redskins followed, each of them alert. They carried tomahawks and knives, and their naked bodies gleamed with paint and oil. Strung around them were scalps of boys as well as of pirates. These were the Pickaninny tribe. Leading them was Great Big Little Panther, the redskin with so many scalps that they got in his way all the time. Lastly, there was the fearless Tiger Lily. She was the most beautiful of her kind, stylish, courageous, and cold and loving when required. As they walked, they hardly made a sound, even when they stepped over dry wood. The only sound that was heard was their breathing. Once the Redskins disappeared, the beasts came out of hiding. Lions, tigers, bears, and every kind of beast. Mostly the man-eaters. Their tongues were hanging out. They were hungry tonight. After they passed, came that last figure of all, a gigantic, hungry-looking crocodile. The Lost Boys came close to their underground home. I do wish Peter would come back, they said nervously, even though in height and breadth that they were all larger than their captain. Just then, Nibs rushed breathless into their midst, pursued by a pack of wolves. The boys quickly gathered around him and made dreadful faces, scaring the wolves away. Suddenly they heard a sound, and they all scampered back onto their hideout. It was the pirates. Captain Hook told his men to spread out. As they walked in different directions, Hook told Smee how much he wanted Peter. That boy cut off his arm and fed it to the crocodile. He will pay dearly for it. Smee, Hook went on huskily, that crocodile would have had me before this, but by a lucky chance it swallowed a clock that goes tick-tock inside it. And so before it can reach me, I hear the tick and run. He laughed, but in his hollow way. Someday, said Smee, the clock will run down, and then he'll get you. Hook wetted his dry lips. Yeah, he said, that's the fear that haunts me. Just then, they noticed a rather large mushroom on the ground. When they pulled it out with some effort, they saw that it blocked an opening from which a lot of smoke was coming out. The pirates looked at each other. A chimney, they both exclaimed. It was indeed a chimney, one that belonged to the underground home of the Lost Boys and Peter Pan. The boys always blocked it with the mushroom wherever the enemies were nearby. Along with smoke, their voices were heard, loud and clear, for they had no fear while in their underground hideout. The pirates listened for a while, and then replaced the mushroom, noticing some holes on 7 trees. "Did you hear them say Peter Pan's come home?" Smee whispered excitedly. Just then the captain heard a tick-tick in the distance. The sound became crystal clear as it came closer. "The crocodile!" Hook cried and bolted hurriedly, followed by Smee. The Lost Boys came out of hiding, and at that moment looked up into the sky. A great white bird. It was flying this way, cried Nibs. "What happened? What kind of bird?" asked the other boys. "I don't know," Nibs said, awe-struck, "but it looks so weary, and as it flies, it moans. Poor Wendy." "Poor Wendy?" "I remember," said Slightly instantly. "There are birds called Wendys." "See, it comes," cried Curly, pointing to Wendy in the skies. Just then Tinkerbell appeared before them and told them that Peter wanted them to shoot Wendy. Not used to obeying Peter, Toodles quickly fitted an arrow to his bow. "Out of the way, Tink," he shouted, and then he fired, and Wendy fluttered to the ground with an arrow in her breast. Chapter 5. The Little House and the Home Under the Ground. Toodles stood like a conquered over Wendy's body when the others ran from the trees. "You are all late. I've shot Wendy. Peter will be so proud of me," he shouted. Slightly was the first to speak. "This is no bird," he said in a scared voice. "I think this must be a lady, and I think we killed her, Toodles." His mouth opened with shock, began to tremble. The boys took off their caps. "Peter was bringing her to us, and you killed her," said Curly. "A lady to take care of us at last," said one of the twins. "And now she's gone?" Toodles was ashamed now and started walking away. "Come back," the others cried. "I can't. I'm too afraid of Peter." At that moment, they all heard a sound that brought fear to their hearts. Peter's crowing. "Peter!" they cried, for he always signaled his return in this manner. "Hide her," they whispered, and gathered hastily around Wendy, but Toodles stood aloof. A second later, Peter dropped to the ground. "Greetings, boys," he cried, smiling. The boys saluted, but didn't seem as excited. Peter frowned. "I am back," he said hotly. "Why do you not cheer?" Before he gave them a chance to reply, he quickly told them excitedly that he had brought along a mother to look after them. "Have you not seen her?" asked Peter. "She flew this way." "Peter," Toodles said quietly, "I will show her to you." And when the others would still have hidden her, he said, "Back, twins, let Peter see." They all stood back and let Peter have a look at her. Peter noticed the arrow that had struck her. He picked it up. "Whose arrow is this?" he growled. "Mine, Peter," said Toodles, who had gone down on his knees. As Peter was about to strike him with the arrow, Wendy's arm moved. "She lives," Peter said briefly. When Peter knelt beside her, he noticed that the arrow had pierced the acorn button he had given her, which she had tied to the chain around her neck. As he tried to revive her, he heard an awful wailing. "That's Tink," said Curly. "She's crying because Wendy lives." Then the boys told them about Tinkerbell and what she made them do, and they never saw him looking angrier. He got to his feet and yelled at the top of his voice, "Tinkerbell, listen to me. I'm no longer your friend. Be gone forever." Tinkerbell rushed and tugged his shoulder, pleading for forgiveness, but he kept brushing her off. Only when he saw Wendy moving slightly did he say, "Not forever, but for a whole week." After she flew away, Peter ordered the boys to build a house around Wendy, as it would be very ungentlemanly to pick her up. She was, after all, a lady. The boys hurriedly went to build the best house for their lady. As they were leaving, John and Michael appeared. When they saw Wendy on the ground, they asked Peter if she was sleeping. When Peter replied that she was, and that he and the lost boys were building a house for her, John said snobbishly, "Whatever for? She's just a girl." "That," exclaimed Curly, "is why we are her servants." "You? Wendy's servants?" "Yes," said Peter, "and you also away with them." The surprised brothers were dragged away to work and toil. After a long time, one of the boys came to check on Wendy. He cried out, "She's moving! Peter!" By the time she woke up fully, the house was completely ready. "Where am I?" Wendy asked. "Lady, we built this house for you," slightly and proudly. "What a lovely, darling house," Wendy said, and they were the very words the boys had hoped she would say. "And we're your children," said the twins. With that, the boys went on their knees with their arms outstretched. "Oh, Wendy, please be our mother." "But I am only a little girl. I have no real experience," Wendy said, taken aback. "It doesn't matter. All we need is a nice motherly person," said Peter. "Well, I know I am that," smiled Wendy. "We know," cried the lost boys. "We saw that at once." "Very well," she said. "I will do my best. Come inside at once before I put you to bed. I have just enough time to finish the story of Cinderella." So in they all went, except Peter, who stood outside to guard the place. After a while, he started falling asleep, and some little fairies came and played about near him. Wendy was being a very good mother. The wicked pirates had slyly baked a poisonous cake for the boys, but Wendy snatched it away before anyone could eat even a bite and saved the boys. One of the first things Peter did the next day was to measure Wendy, John, and Michael for hollow trees. Wendy and Michael fitted their trees at the first try, but John had to be altered a little. They grew to love their home under the ground, especially Wendy. Peter, along with Wendy, invented a new game. They did not involve adventures like sitting on stools, flinging balls in the air, pushing one another, etc. To see Peter sitting doing nothing on a stool was a great sight. Imagination and make-believe played a very important role in Peter's and his friends' lives. It was so powerful, so real, that even if there was nothing on a plate, all you had to do was make believe that your plate was filled with things to eat. Wendy's favorite pastime was sewing and darning after the entire household was asleep. She spent the free time she had in making new clothes for the boys. The pet wolf Wendy had dreamt very soon discovered that she was on the island, and it followed her everywhere. Chapter 6, The Mermaid's Lagoon. The children often spent long summer days on the lagoon, swimming or floating most of the time, playing the mermaid game in the water. But that didn't mean that the mermaids were friendly. Often Wendy would go to the edge of a mariner's rock so that she could see the mermaids basking in the sun and combing their long hair. If ever she was in the water, they would splash water all over her with their tails intentionally. They even treated the boys the same way, all except Peter. They would chat with Peter for hours on Mariner's Rock. But the lagoon was as dangerous as the night as it was beautiful in the morning. The moment the moon rose, one heard hunting wails coming from the depths. During the day, the mermaids played their games with bubbling bowls made with the colors of the rainbow. John introduced a new way of hitting the bubble with the head instead of the hand, and the mermaids quickly adopted it. This was the one mark that John left on Neverland. One fatal night at the Mariner's Rock, Peter stood still, cocking his ears from this way to that, his eyes widened. "Pirates! They're coming this way," he whispered harshly. He signaled the boys awake. A strange smile was playing about his face. Wendy saw it and shuddered. While that smile was on his face, no one dared address him. All they could do was to stand ready to obey. The order came sharply. "Dive!" Within a second, the lagoon seemed deserted. A boat drew close. In the boat were Smee, Starkey, and the redskin captive, Tiger Lily. They had tied her hands and ankles. The two pirates did not see the rock till they crashed straight into it. "Lift, you lubber!" cried an Irish voice that was Smee's. "Here's the rock. Now then, what we have to do is to hoist the redskin onto it and leave her here to drown." Behind the rock, Wendy and Peter saw the entire incident. Wendy started crying as this was the very first tragedy she had ever seen. But Peter paid her no heed. He was worried about Tiger Lily. He knew he had to save her. He quickly imitated the voice of Captain Hook. "Ahoy there, you lubbers!" he called. It was a marvelous imitation. "The captain?" said the pirates, staring at one another in surprise. "You have put the redskins on the rock," Smee called out. "Set her free," come to the astonishing answer. "Free?" "Yes. Cut her bonds and let her go." "But, Captain, at once, do you hear?" cried Peter, "or I'll plunge my hook into the two of you." "Better do what the captain orders," said Starkey nervously. "Aye, aye," Smee said, and he cut Tiger Lily's cords. At once, like an eel, she slid between Starkey's legs into the water. "Boat ahoy!" came a voice, but this time it was not Peter who had spoken. Now Wendy understood. The real Hook was also in the water. He was swimming towards the boat, guided by the lamp of the lantern with one of his men. "Captain, is all well?" they asked timidly. But he answered with a hollow moan. Then at last he spoke passionately. "The game's up," he cried. "Those boys have found a mother." "What's a mother?" asked the ignorant Smee. Wendy was so shocked that she exclaimed, "He doesn't know?" Peter pulled her beneath the water, for Hook had become alert and cried, "What was that?" "I heard nothing," said Starkey, raising the lantern over the waters. And as the pirates looked, they saw a strange sight. There was a nest floating on the river with a never bird in it. "See," said Hook in answer to Smee's question. "That is a mother." What a lesson! The nest must have fallen into the water, but would the mother desert her eggs? No. "Captain," said Smee, "could we not kidnap the boy's mother and make her our mother?" "Brilliant idea!" cried Hook. "We will seize the children and carry them to the boat. The boys will walk the plank, and Wendy shall be our mother." They all agreed. Suddenly, Hook remembered Tiger Lily. "Where is to capture redskins?" he demanded abruptly. His men thought he was still in a playful mood. "We let her go, just like you told us to," giggled Smee. "Let her go? You told us to," the pirates argued. "Rubbish!" cried Hook. "I've given no such orders." "Blimey, this is all strange," muttered Smee. Hook looked around the lagoon. "Spirits that haunt the lagoon tonight, can you hear me?" Peter, even though he should have kept quiet, answered Hook. "Aye, I hear ye." Hook didn't even pale. "Who are you?" he shouted. "I am James Hook, captain of the Jolly Roger," the voice ranged back. "And you are just a codfish." Hook gulped once or twice and tried to guess who was speaking. "Do you have another voice?" Peter, who could never resist a game, replied in his own voice. "I do." "Boy?" "Yes." "Ordinary boy?" "No." "Wonderful boy?" "Yes." "Are you in England?" "No." "Are you here?" "Yes." Hook was completely puzzled. "You asked him some questions," he said to the others, wiping his damp brow. Smee reflected. "I can't think of a thing," he said regretfully. Can't guess, cried Peter. "Do you give it up?" Of course, in his pride, he was carrying the game too far, and the villains saw their chance. Yes, they answered eagerly. "Well then," he cried excitedly, "I am Peter Pan." "Now we know who the mischief maker is, and we will soon have him," Hook shouted into the water. "Smee, Starkey, mind the boat. Take Peter Pan dead or alive." The fight was short and gallant. While the lost boys went after Smee and Starkey, Peter went for Hook. Hook had climbed up a rock to catch some air, and Peter flew to meet him. He saw that he was higher up the rock than his foe. It would not have been fighting fair. He gave Hook a hand to help him up. It was then that Hook bit him. What stunned Peter was not the pain, but the unfairness at which he got bitten. A few minutes later, however, the lost boy saw Hook swimming away in the water, a look of pure terror on his face. The hungry crocodile, which had appeared ticking just in time, chased him stealthily. The boys were worried about Peter and Wendy, whom they couldn't find. They began searching around the lagoon for them. Suddenly, they saw Wendy slumped against a weak Peter on a small rock, which would soon be underwater. Just then, something light brushed against Peter's cheek. It was the tail of a kite that Michael made a few days earlier. Peter looked at it, and the next instant he grabbed the tail of the kite and pulled it to him. It lifted Michael off the ground. He cried, "Why should it not carry you?" "Both of us?" Wendy wondered. It can't lift two." Michael and Curly tried. "Let us draw lots." "Ladies first, I say," said Peter softly as he tied the kite's tail around her waist. She clung to him and refused to go without him, but with a "Goodbye, Wendy," he pushed her from the rock, and in a few minutes she was borne out of his sight. Peter was alone on the lagoon. For a moment he felt a tremor of fear and nervousness go through him as he stood alone in the lagoon on the rock. Next moment he was standing erect on the rock again with that smile on his face and a drum beating within him. It was saying, to die will be an awfully big adventure. Chapter 7, The Never Bird. The last sound that Peter heard before he was truly alone was that of mermaids retiring to their underwater chambers. Once the water settled again, his attention went to something floating in the lagoon. It was the Never Bird making desperate efforts to reach Peter on the nest. She had come to save him, to give him her nest, though there were eggs in it. Neither of them understood the other's language. Nevertheless, the bird managed to get her nest to him, and then she flew away, making room for him with her eggs. She looked down, hoping he'd understand her. It took him a moment, but he did. She saw him climb into the nest and examine her eggs. She covered her eggs with her wings, but she couldn't help looking between the feathers. He took out her eggs and placed them on his hat. They floated rather well. Relieved, the Never Bird flew to her eggs and snuggled herself over them. She drifted in one direction, and he was borne off in another, both cheering. The lost boys rejoiced the return of their captain in their underground home. Peter came back around the same time Wendy did, who was taken for a joyride by the kite. But Wendy, though happy to have them all home again, safe and sound, was bothered by the lateness of the hour and cried, to bed, in a voice that had to be obeyed. Next day, however, she was awfully tender and gave out bandages to everyone who was hurt. The boys played till bedtime, pretending to limp about and carrying their arms in false slings. Chapter 8, The Happy Home. The Redskins became Peter's friends as he had saved Tiger Lily from their dreadful fate. She and her tribe owed their lives to him. All night they sat around Peter's home, keeping guard. During the day, they'd smoke their pipe of peace. They called Peter the Great White Father. Each time he appeared before them, they'd bow down on their knees, which pleased Peter immensely. The Great White Father, he would say to them in a very lordly manner as they groveled at his feet, is glad to see the Pickaninny warriors protecting his wigwam from the pirates. Me, Tiger Lily, the lovely redskin would say. Peter Pan saved me. Me, his very nice friend. Me, no let pirates hurt him. Even Wendy was very happy. After the meals, she would tell the boys to clear away the dining table. She would then sit down to her work basket with a heavy load of stockings to mend. Almost every knee would have a hole in it. As she sewed, she would watch the boys playing with one another. This had become such a common scene, a scene she had grown to love. She would hear a sharp step above her and tell the boys that Peter would like them to meet him upstairs. Peter would bring nuts for the boys as well as the correct time for Wendy. Peter, you just spoil them, you know, Wendy would say with a warm smile. One day, the first twin came to Peter. Father, we want to dance. Dance away, my little man, said Peter, who was in a merry mood. But we want you to dance. Peter was really the best dancer among them, but he pretended to be scandalized. Me? My old bones would rattle, he cried. And mother, too. What? Cried Wendy. The mother of such an armful dance? Wendy told the boys that she would dance only after they would get into their nighties. Peter sat down with her near the fire and said, There is nothing more I like than to spend my evenings with you by the fire after a hard day's work with the little ones at my feet. She went to him and put her hand on his shoulder. Dear Peter, she said, with such a large family, of course, I have now become old and tired, but you don't want to change me, do you? No, Wendy. And he fell silent after that. Peter, what is it? Asked Wendy after a while. This is all just make-believe, right? Me being a father? Of course, said Wendy. Peter sighed with relief. You see, I would feel old if I really were their father. But they are our children, yours and mine. Not really. Wendy took a deep breath and continued, Peter, what are your feelings toward me? Like that of a noble son, Peter replied solemnly. I thought so. Saying this, she went to a far corner of the room. Peter commented on how strange women were, including Tiger Lily. She says she wants to become something to me, but not my mother. What is it then? Wondered Peter aloud. A lady doesn't speak of such things, Wendy replied primly. Fine. I'll just go ask Tinkerbell, said Peter. Tinkerbell came out from her room and immediately began being rude to Wendy. After that, the mood changed. The next hour was filled with dancing and singing. They even ended up having pillow fights, and they told one another stories before it was time to hear Wendy's goodnight story. When Wendy began her story, it was one that the boys loved but Peter hated. Normally, when she'd tell this story, he'd go out to the room, or he'd cover his ears with his hands. But tonight, he just sat on the stool and watched Wendy tell the lost boys her story. And there you are. We were going to stop right here, and you can catch chapter 9 through 15 next Saturday. So y'all be looking out for my next video, so you can hear the end of the story of Peter Pan. And I will catch y'all next time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. And I hope to catch y'all next weekend. I'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye. Mwah.